Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD Pro Physique Athlete. Today we're going to be talking all about body recomposition, that is building muscle and losing fat at the same time. This is a very popular strategy for improving your physique, but there are a lot of misconceptions out there about it. Some people say it is impossible, some people say it's the best thing and everyone should do it, and some people think that it's just wasting your time. To clear the air, body recomposition has been demonstrated to happen in multiple scientific studies. But there are some nuances about who is able to achieve body recomposition and how efficient it actually is. We're going to start off by talking about who can actually achieve body recomposition, because this is a strategy that won't be feasible for everyone. After that, we'll talk about how to actually achieve body recomposition through diet and training. And finally, I'll talk about some of the pros and cons of the strategy and give some recommendations on whether you should do it yourself. First, let's talk about who's actually able to achieve body recomposition. My overarching criteria is that you need to apply a novel, superior programming stimulus. That is, you need to be significantly improving your programming, whether from a training or a diet standpoint or both, compared to what you were doing before. Let's go into some further categories. Now, there are 5 main categories for people who are able to achieve body recomposition. First of all, we have beginners. So those in their first 1 to 2 years of serious training are going to be applying a novel and superior stimulus just by getting into the gym and training hard. People will term this as the newbie effect. And it is true that as a beginner, you are the most sensitive in your entire training career to the hypertrophy stimulus. Just by virtue of jumping on a consistent training program that utilizes progressive overload and getting enough protein is going to make a huge difference in your hypertrophy environment, and you're going to grow. Recomposition isn't the easiest thing for the body to pull off, but in cases like this, when you're a beginner, the hypertrophy stimulus is so strong that you're going to be able to build muscle even while losing fat. Next, we have people who are returning from a layoff. If you're coming back from a few months or even a few years off from the gym, getting back into the training routine is going to be similar to like when you were a beginner. And you will be able to achieve body recomposition again, just like you did in your beginner state. And again, coming back to the gym is implementing a novel and superior stimulus in terms of programming of what you were doing before. There's a big difference in hypertrophy stimulus when you get back into the gym and start training again with progressive overload rather than lying on the couch and watching Netflix. Now note that most people you see in community gyms actually fall in these first 2 categories. Most people are either just starting out or don't really stick to their training programming, and they'll end up training a few months on, a few months off. So they're basically always in this returning from a layoff state. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's really common to talk to people in the gym and they'll say, yeah man, fell off track for a little bit, but I'm getting back into the groove. Now the next group of people who are able to recomp are those who make a major improvement in their programming. And this includes your training and diet strategy. So if you finally switch over to a program that has appropriate training volumes for you, hits your major compound movements, and applies progressive overload, you are going to make big gains. Note that this also applies to diet and recovery. Finally, getting your protein right will make a big difference, and recovery is one that's often slept on. Making major improvements in any of these 3 categories is going to have a big impact, and you will likely be able to achieve body recomposition. Now, the next category are those who are obese. The idea is that when you're higher in body fat percentage, you have more calories to go around since you can tap into fat source for energy. Note that a lot of people who aren't in good shape actually fall into one of these earlier 2 categories. If you are a high-level bodybuilder who just happens to be running in a very high body fat percentage range, I suspect that body recomposition would not be as feasible. Finally, people who are on performance-enhancing drugs are going to be more likely to be able to recomp. Since I talk exclusively about natural bodybuilding on this channel, we're not going to be talking about PEDs anymore. Okay, now let's talk about how to achieve body recomposition if you fall into one of those categories that I mentioned earlier. Let's talk about training first. Training for body recomposition is going to be the same as if when you're bulking or cutting. A lot of people will talk about body recomposition as some magical state and that you need a special training and diet formula to get there. Instead, you should think about bulking and cutting as a spectrum where body recomposition happens somewhere in the middle. Muscle growth and fat loss are to a degree separate processes, so just because you're building muscle doesn't mean you can't build fat. So I really want you to think about just setting up your training for the ideal hypertrophy stimulus, which is basically everything we talk about on this channel. First of all, you'll want a consistent program that utilizes progressive overload, so you want to be generally getting stronger in the same rep ranges over time. Next, you'll want to find an appropriate volume for you in terms of the number of sets for each muscle group per week. A lot of people will throw around the 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week number. This is a very broad strokes recommendation, and it will vary a lot depending on the muscle group and the person. So I'd recommend that you experiment to find what works best for you. If you are just starting out, you won't need very much volume at all in order to progress. And you want to be tweaking your volumes in order to drive progressive overload. Basically, the number of sets that allows you to progress the fastest is going to be best. Next, you want to make sure you're training hard enough. So I recommend somewhere between 1 to 2 reps in reserve but as long as you're about 4 RIR or harder, you're going to be probably decent. In terms of rep ranges, I recommend training with a variety of rep ranges in the 6 to 20 rep range for the most part. I typically suggest having about 2/3 of your volume in the 6 to 12 rep range and about 1/3 lying outside of that rep range. Again, this will vary a lot depending on the person and on the exercise, but you can look at my free program templates on this channel for inspiration. Okay, now let's talk about the diet for body recomposition. The most important thing to get right is going to be your overall calories, and I recommend aiming for maintenance or a deficit. A lot of people talk about the maintenance strategy as gaintaining, so basically trying to keep your body weight around stable and then losing fat and gaining muscle. This strategy can be useful because you have a solid benchmark of your scale weight, so you know that you want to be keeping your scale weight consistent, and you know that if you're getting stronger in the gym and if you're looking better in the mirror, then you are going to be achieving body recomposition. I typically define progression as improving your multi-set 6 to 12 rep max. So if you're getting stronger over multiple sets in the 6 to 12 rep range, you're probably building muscle. And if your weight is staying stable in that state, that means you must be losing fat in order to make up for that tissue. Now you can also go for a deficit and still build muscle. A lot of people say that this is impossible, but it's actually been shown in multiple studies that people in calorie deficits can still build muscle while losing fat. I actually think a deficit is a very efficient strategy because if you fall into one of the categories we mentioned before, say if you're a beginner, you're going to be so sensitive to the training stimulus that you're going to build muscle well even in a deficit. In general, if you're a beginner, for example, you can probably still build muscle and lose fat simultaneously, even in deficits of up to 1.5% of your body weight lost per week. And if you're obese, you could probably even lose weight at a faster rate, up to 2% of your body weight per week. Note that the amount of deficit that's going to be applicable for you will vary depending on your training status and where you fall in terms of those other categories. If you are a bit more advanced, you may not be able to recomp in a steep deficit, but perhaps you might be able to still recomp in a very small deficit or at maintenance. But I think a lot of people underestimate how aggressively they're actually able to cut and still build muscle at the same time when they're beginners. I actually think this is a great way to go if you have body fat to lose. If you fit into the categories we talked about before, you'll probably still be able to build muscle, and it's going to get you to your goals faster. Next thing in terms of diet is going to be protein, so you want a minimum of 0.72 to 1.0 grams of protein per pound of body weight per day. Getting your protein and calories right are going to be the biggest priorities from a nutrition standpoint for recomposition. Okay, now let's give you some recommendations on who should actually go for recomp. And this is assuming that it's actually possible for you, so you fall into one of those 5 categories. We've established that recomposition is a viable strategy, but I actually don't think it's necessarily optimal for everyone. I think if you're a beginner and you're at a higher body fat percentage, like greater than 15% for men or 25% for women, then body recomposition could be a viable strategy, in that it could give you some of your fastest results, particularly if you aim for a deficit, as I suggested earlier. I do recommend people try and stay in an optimal body fat percentage range, which is on the leaner end of about 10 to 15% for men and 18 to 25% for women. So if you are significantly above this, a body recomposition strategy could help to bring you back down to that optimal body fat percentage range while continuing to build muscle. Now, if you are beyond the beginner stage, I'd recommend not necessarily trying to chase body recomposition. If you set your calories at maintenance, you could achieve body recomposition, or you could just be spinning your wheels. Particularly for people who are advanced, the threshold for achieving hypertrophy is actually pretty high, and it really helps to actually be in a calorie surplus. So if you're not in a calorie surplus, like you're in maintenance or in a deficit, you're likely to not actually build muscle. And in these scenarios, I do recommend going for a bulking and cutting strategy, just because it's going to get you to your goals faster. Now that I've been training for 11 years, for example, if I set my calories right at maintenance, I don't really build muscle at all or at an undetectable rate. Now, say if you are an intermediate and you still want to go for body recomposition, you could do so as long as you're not in a rush. At higher levels of experience, body recomposition will not be the most efficient strategy. You will want to maximize your time in a calorie surplus to really build muscle. And since it's a lot harder to build muscle than it is to lose fat, you'll be able to strip off the fat during fat loss phases while maintaining your muscle. Next, you could try gaintaining strategy if you can't accept fat gain. Some people just really hate the idea of putting on body fat. So in this scenario, it is reasonable to go for body recomposition. I will note though that if you are starting off skinny, at some point you're gonna have to put on weight to build muscle. They say that you can't carve a statue out of a pebble. So say if you're a tall, skinny guy who weighs 120 pounds, even if you converted every ounce of body fat on your frame into muscle, you still wouldn't be that big. And the other aspect of this is that if you can't tolerate fat loss phases, that is, you know that if you bulk hard, you're not going to be able to lose the fat later, then you would want to be more careful about your calorie surplus. In these cases, if you're going to gaintain, again, if your body fat is higher, you could go for a maintenance or calorie deficit. And if your body fat percentage is already low, you could just aim for a very tiny calorie surplus and let your weight creep up over time. Now I want to emphasize again here that I talked about body recomposition in the context of maintenance calories or in a deficit. So achieving body recomposition in a deficit isn't really any different than a fat loss phase. This is why in general, I do recommend people try and go for a bulking and cutting strategy. And when you're in a calorie deficit, if you're able to actually build muscle at the same time and achieve body recomposition, then it'll happen. And if it doesn't, it doesn't, but you'll at least be able to maintain your muscle. Have you tried body recomposition in the past? What was your experience? Let us know in the comments below. If you want to learn about how to set up your diet for optimal fat loss and body recomposition, check out my book, Dr. Swole's Fat Loss and Body Recomposition Manual, where I go through all the nuance from the nutrition side, which is really underrated. If you're thinking about going into a calorie deficit, check out this video where I go through the A to Z of creating a proper calorie deficit for fat loss. Getting your nutrition right is critical for fat loss and body recomposition because you want to make sure that you're not losing muscle during this process. Make sure you subscribe to the channel to upgrade your science-based fitness knowledge, and we'll see you next time.